Welcome everyone. I'm John Spires, Chief Executive of the Royal Free Charity. This event is part of a series of talks hosted by the Royal Free Charity. We bring these events to you as a way of showcasing some of the outstanding work at the Royal Free London NHS Foundation Trust. Our previous episodes have featured cutting-edge research, clinical innovations, and best practice in the delivery of patient care. Most of the subjects we feature receive Royal Free Charity funding, and the Trust also benefits from a range of services that we deliver. Our volunteers work across the Trust in a myriad of roles. We run a complementary therapy service for patients, and we have a support hub offering welfare advice for patients with long-term conditions. None of this would be possible without the generosity of our donors and our supporters. And many of you watching today will have supported the charity by giving time, money, or advocacy. And I want to take the opportunity to thank you. It's because of that support that we and the Royal Free London can go beyond the limitations of NHS funding to achieve our joint clinical and research ambitions. Welcome back to those of you who've joined us in previous talks. And for the benefit of those joining us for the first time, I'll quickly run through tonight's format. In a moment, I'll introduce and hand over to our guest speaker. And after the main talk, I'll put your questions to our speaker. You can type those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout the talk, and I'll do my best to get through as many of those questions as possible. We're recording this event tonight, and we'll be posting it on our RFC Presents YouTube channel, where you can also find recordings of the earlier events in this series. If you're tweeting about the event tonight, please use the hashtag RFC Presents. But now to the talk itself. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Tim Meyer. Tim is a medical oncologist specializing in hepatocellular carcinoma and neuroendocrine tumors. He runs a specialist clinic for patients with liver cancer. A professor of experimental cancer medicine, Tim's main research interest is cancer drug development. Tim is also a director of the Royal Free London's Clinical Research Facility, which we'll be referring to throughout this evening as the CRF. He joins us tonight to tell us how patients benefit from closer working between clinicians and researchers, and how a recent funding boost for the CRF will make a huge difference for translating early stage research into treatments for patients. Over to you, Tim.
Great, thank you very much, John, and thank you for joining this seminar. So as John mentioned, I'm a medical oncologist. My main area of interest is in hepatocellular carcinoma, particularly focused on drug development. And I also have the privilege of being the first director of the Royal Free Clinical Research Facility, which is going to be the focus of this talk. So next slide. So what I'm going to cover over the next 25 minutes or so is explain what a clinical research facility actually is. I'm then going to go over the development of the Royal Free Clinical Research Facility, how that actually happened. I'm going to describe how the CRF enables better collaboration between clinicians and scientists. And importantly, at the end, I'm going to give the opportunity for one of our patients to explain what a CRF means to patients. Next slide, please. So first of all, what is a clinical research facility? And to explain this, I need to go through what is commonly referred to as the translational pipeline. Next slide. So next slide. So the translational pipeline really describes how drugs are taken from fundamental discoveries in the laboratory through to clinical use in the community. So we start off in the laboratory with laboratory science, and this can be directed. So for example, the discovery or the development of Herceptin or trastuzumab for breast cancer started with the identification of genes which were responsible for driving cancer, in this case in breast cancer. So that was, if you like, directed laboratory research where the scientists were setting out to understand and find a treatment for cancer. But importantly, these discoveries or breakthroughs can also occur in the setting of undirected research. And the classic example of that is the development of cisplatin, which is a commonly used chemotherapy drug and was the first drug to cure testicular cancer back in the 70s. And this drug was actually discovered by a biophysicist who was investigating the effect of electromagnetism on bacteria and found that the electromagnetic current appeared to inhibit division of the bacteria. So it took quite a while to work out that in fact it was not the electricity, but it was the platinum leaching off the electrode that was actually killing or arresting the division of the bacteria. And that led him to hypothesize that it might be useful for treating cancer, and so the story began. So two examples of discovery science, one of which directed and the other undirected, and it's really important that both are supported in our university laboratories. So having identified what is thought to be a promising therapeutic, the next step is to test it in what's called preclinical testing. And this involves using a cell model, for example, cells in a petri dish, or animal models. Once, if those results appear promising, those are taken through to clinical research. And this process involves the initial early phase trials, in which the prime aim is to establish whether these drugs are safe to give to patients, what are the potential side effects, how the body handles them, so that you can establish the dosing, the dose to be given, the frequency it's given, and also look for early signs of efficacy. So in other words, does this drug do what we thought it did, and is there any evidence of beneficial effect? So once they progress through early phase trials and they're still promising, then they're taken through to late phase trials. And these are much larger trials. So I should have said early phase trials usually just a few tens of patients, whereas the late phase trials involve hundreds or even thousands of patients. And in this case, the new therapy is compared with an existing therapy, usually in a randomized trial, to make a fair and unbiased comparison. If a drug is successful in late phase trials, then it moves through into the health service once it's passed the various regulatory hurdles and gains approval from bodies such as NICE. So having gone through these stages, next slide, it can then move into healthcare, where it becomes routine practice to deliver this therapy. Now, it's important to note that a couple of things. Firstly, this is not a unidirectional pipeline. So observations that are made in the clinic or in clinical trials, or tissue that is obtained during clinical trials, can also go back to the laboratory and in an iterative process refine the clinical research that we undertake. The other important aspect is that these trials can take a very long time. So for example, between the discovery of the drug which is targeted by, the gene which is targeted by Herceptin, to the approval of Herceptin for breast cancer was around 20 years, and it took about 13 years for cisplatin to be approved for the treatment of testicular cancer after it was discovered in the laboratory. So these are firstly take a long time, and also there is an attrition. So just because a drug enters early phase clinical trials doesn't mean that it's going to turn out to be successful. And so far the success rate is around 8%. So 8% of drugs entering early phase clinical trials ultimately get approved. Next slide. So where does the CRF fit in this pipeline? Well, it's really a facility that allows us to conduct early phase clinical trials in a highly regulated and safe environment. Now, having a CRF enables us now to traverse the entire pipeline. Next slide, please. So here at the Royal Free, having established the CRF, we can now take laboratory discoveries, such as those happening in the Pears building, which you see on the left. So this is part of our partner university, UCL, which is one of the global leaders in biomedical research. And the Pears building, again, was enabled by the Royal Free Charity. So the discoveries that are made there can be translated through clinical trials undertaken in the clinical research facility and through into late phase trials and ultimately healthcare in the Royal Free Hospital, which, as many of you know, is one of the largest acute trusts in the country. Next slide. So the RCRF has now been funded by the National Institute for Health and Care Research, and this is the largest funder of biomedical research or clinical research in the country. And these statements really summarize the key importance that CRFs play for the UK in biomedical research. So NIHR CRFs are a key part of the UK's leading early stage clinical research infrastructure and play an important role in making the country a global hub for the life sciences. In the past year, 20 to 21, NIHR CRFs have supported just under 5,000 studies, and nearly 20% of these were first-in-human trials. And importantly, the investment that the NIHR made leveraged an additional 144 million funding from life science industry and other funders. So that pretty much doubles the investment that the NIHR made and is an important marker of its success. And then finally, many of you will be aware that the UK made an extraordinary contribution to developing new therapies and vaccines for COVID-19. So within the space of a year, so I mentioned how long it takes to develop drugs ordinarily, so it can be 10 or 20 years. In this case, new treatments and vaccines were available in just over a year from the onset of the epidemic. And the clinical research facilities were a crucial component of the nation's response to COVID-19. Next slide. So moving on, I wanted to just tell you a bit about the development of the Royal Free Clinical Research Facility. Next slide. So this really presents the timeline. It was actually proposed in the 2017-2020 R&D strategy, and in fact we had quite detailed plans for the facility, but then along came COVID, and as with many other grand plans, it was put on the shelf while the hospital was pretty much turned into an acute COVID hospital, and all resources were directed to the management of patients with COVID. However, in January of last year, the Royal Free Group Executive approved the business case for the CRF to go ahead and allocated very generous space on the second floor of the hospital. Obviously, space is important, but more important is having staff to actually deliver these very complicated trials. And we were fortunate that the Royal Free Charity enabled pump prime funding to appoint key staff, and that allowed us to open the CRF in April of last year. Having appointed the staff and got the operation underway, in September, we submitted an application to NIHR for funding, and I think because we had the space and we had the staff, we were able to make a very compelling case, and in February this year that was rewarded with the announcement that the Royal Free had been funded to the tune of just under 5 million for the next 5 years. So as of the 1st of September this year, we will formally become an NIHR CRF, and our staff will be funded for the next 5 years. Next slide, please. So what do we have? What will the Royal Free CRF do? First of all, it provides dedicated space. So you can see half of our 8-patient treatment bay, but it also provides clinic space, pharmacy and laboratory space. Next slide. We were very fortunate with the Royal Free Charity pump priming, allowed us to appoint an exceptional leadership team with Kate Blackstone, our general manager, who came with huge experience from managing another London CRF. Nia Vose, our lead research nurse, who also had experience of setting up another CRF in London. And finally, Lucy Shuttleworth, our QA manager, who originally was a pharmacist, but has really been critical in setting up our SOPs, our standard operation procedures, and our governance structures. Next slide. In addition to our leadership team, we've appointed other key staff, including data managers, research nurses, laboratory technicians, all of whom play a critical role in the management of patients and the delivery of the research protocol. Next slide. We also are able to provide overnight facilities for patients involved in clinical research. So within the Royal Free Hospital, we have overnight beds for those patients who require overnight monitoring, but we also have fantastic hotel type accommodation in the Pairs building. So in the 4th and 5th floor of the Pairs building, there are very nice rooms, some of which have their own kitchen, and patients who are traveling long distances or need to stay for multi-day investigations or procedures can spend the night there and then come back to the hospital the next day for ongoing management. Next slide. The CRF is really established to undertake complicated studies, and you see here Professor Mark Liddell, who manages the cell production therapies unit at the Royal Free. So this involves genetically engineering cells and delivering them back to the patient. So it's highly complex, and the Royal Free hosts one of the biggest cell manufacturing units in Europe, and delivers truly innovative trials for patients with various types of cancer. Next slide. And I think one of the other important aspects of being an NIHR CRF is that we've become part of a network. So there are now 28 NIHR CRFs across the country, and these help to make the country a global hub for life sciences and deliver the government's life science industrial strategy. And you can see the map on the right-hand side. The orange dots illustrate the NIHR-funded CRFs, but there are also additional CRFs dotted around which are not NIHR-funded, but also make an important contribution to biomedical and clinical research. Next slide. So one of the key aspects, I guess, is that our local and distant populations get the opportunity to participate in leading edge biomedical research and access new treatments. And until we had established the CRF, our patients had to be referred outside of the trust to other clinical research facilities across the city, and that obviously was inconvenient. And it's now a great opportunity to offer our local patients these innovative studies. Next slide. So I wanted to give you an example of how the CRF enables better collaboration between clinicians and scientists by focusing on a very specific example. Next slide. And I'm going to tell you about the PRIMER-1 trial. As I mentioned, I'm a medical oncologist. My main interest is in the management of primary liver cancer, which, although is not particularly common in the UK, it's one of the most rapidly increasing cancers in the West. And in fact, globally, is the third leading cause of cancer death. So when setting up a clinical trial, you first have to define the clinical problem. Next slide. And in this case, the clinical problem is that 50% of patients with primary liver cancer relapse within 3 years of surgery, and therefore they are not cured despite having had a good operation. To date, no drugs have been shown to reduce that risk. So unlike breast cancer or colon cancer, where giving chemotherapy or hormone therapy after an operation, the risk of recurrence is reduced, we have no drugs which fulfill that role in liver cancer. However, in the last few years, there have been great progress in treatment of advanced liver cancer, and we now have new immunotherapy drugs which are very effective in about 30% of cases. Next slide. So the hypothesis is for this study that the addition of new immunotherapy-based combinations before and after surgery will reduce the risk of recurrence. So that's, if you like, the clinical hypothesis that we're trying to address with the trial. But then the second is that understanding the immune landscape and the effective therapy will allow us to overcome resistance and develop more effective therapy. So this is really a more scientific question, and by designing a protocol, we aim to address both the clinical question and also address some fundamental research questions. Next slide. So having defined the clinical question and the hypothesis, one has to develop a protocol which will allow you to answer these hypotheses. Next slide. And this is what a protocol looks like, or the scheme for a protocol. As you can see here, what happens is that 60 patients who agree to participate in the trial are randomly allocated to 3 different treatments, all of which have been shown to be effective in advanced liver cancer. So we know these are that liver cancer is sensitive to these treatments. These treatments are given for 6 weeks, and then there is a 1-week break. The patient then has surgery, and after recovering from surgery, continues with immunotherapy for another 12 months. And you'll note, in addition to the clinical aspect, there are also purple lines purple arrows during which blood and tissue is collected, and that is the key aspect of this trial for answering the scientific question. So those samples are then taken to the research laboratories where they are analysed and hopefully will inform future trials. So the other important aspect of clinical trial development is that one needs to involve many different parties. So although the original idea to do this trial was mine, I had input from my fellow oncologists in terms of the treatment, also the surgeons, my fellow surgeons who I work with, and also the laboratory scientists. But it was also critical that we had input from patients when we designed this trial, and we had a very specific question that we wanted advice from patients about, and that was, what is the acceptable interval that patients will accept between told that they need an operation and actually having an operation to allow us to give treatment in between. Ordinarily, one sees a surgeon, the surgeon says you need an operation, and then there are some other investigations and a patient has an operation over the coming weeks. In this case, we're asking patients to undergo a period of drug treatment before they have an operation, and we asked patients whether the acceptable interval between for that drug treatment could be 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and so on. And the message we got back was that they felt that 6 or 7 weeks was acceptable, provided we could provide evidence that that would not disadvantage patients, that delay which is available. So that was really important and has directly had an input in the trial design. Next slide. Having developed the protocol, one then needs to convince funders that it's worth funding, and we were fortunate here in that MSD, the drug company, agreed to provide all of the drugs at no cost, and they also provided a grant and then let us get on with the trial. So that allowed us to deliver the clinical part of the trial, but for the laboratory side, we were fortunate to receive funding as part of a Cancer Research UK Accelerator grant specifically for liver cancer, and that is funding 3 groups who are delivering the laboratory side of this project. Next slide. Having got funding, one then needs to identify a sponsor who takes the responsibility for organising, monitoring and reporting of the trial. We're very fortunate to be linked with UCL, who agreed to sponsor the study and delegated a lot of the administration and the management to one of the cancer trial centres that is associated with UCL. Next slide. Having got sponsorship and funding, one then needs to identify sites, and to deliver a trial of this complexity, one needs ideally a clinical research facility such as we now have. One also needs a specialist clinical trial pharmacy, which will have dedicated trial stock. Next slide. And we also need very close links with the laboratory, and we're very fortunate at the Royal Free and UCL that we have some outstanding immunologists who we work with in the pairs building. This picture is of Glorianne, who is a trainee medical oncologist, and she's doing a PhD with Marla Maney, who's a professor in the pairs building, and she is doing all of the work analysing the tissue and the blood to try and understand the immune microenvironment and how the drugs that we give alter that microenvironment and help us understand which patients are likely to benefit, and for those patients who don't appear to benefit, what we can do to improve treatments in the future. Next slide. So the last 2 points, first of all, we need patients, and this comes back to the trial design. We need patients to understand and buy into the trial, so the question that we're addressing has to be relevant to them, and the trial protocol has to be acceptable. And if it's not acceptable, it's not relevant, patients won't consent to participate, and it's impossible to do research. So without patients' participation, medical research simply doesn't happen. And the final point is the other type of patients. As you can see, we've had to go through a lot of steps, and I'm delighted to say that this trial is due to open at the end of June. But the whole journey in terms of the initial drafting of the protocol started 3 years ago. So this is a long process, but we're now underway, and we hope that within 2 to 3 years, we will have answered some of the questions that we've set out in this protocol. So next slide. So in the final section of this talk, I really just wanted to hand over to a patient of mine who has been participating in an early phase clinical trial, and she really fantastically describes what it means to be a patient, what is the motivation for patients to participate in these clinical trials. And although not all patients benefit, some do, and the benefits can really transform their lives. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Megan, who will describe her experience of the CRF. Great. Well, thanks. So I think that Megan really explains what it's all about, and why we're so delighted to finally have a clinical research facility. But I do want to acknowledge the tremendous support that we've had from the Royal Free Hospital in terms of providing the space, allowing us to get the clinical research facility up and running. The Royal Free Charity made a huge difference. So their initial pump priming investment resulted within 12 months of a multi-million-pound investment from NIHR and the NIHR itself, all of our CRF staff, the investigators, of which there are an increasing number at the Royal Free, the scientists who support the cutting-edge research that is going on, and last but by no means least, the patients, as I said, without whom we cannot do clinical research. So I'm happy to stop there and take any questions.
Thank you, Tim. That was wonderful, and thank you to Megan for sharing her story with us as well. So the first question I've got is around research active hospitals. So obviously it's great for patients like Megan who have the opportunity to access completely novel treatments within the context of a trial and hopefully see good results from that. But what are the benefits more broadly for our patients? Do we see better outcomes for patients who are treated in research active environments?
Yeah, I think that there is good evidence that research active hospitals do have better outcomes. The rigor with which clinical trials are conducted means that patients are very closely monitored. and any side effects are managed very quickly. It also means that if treatment is not working, then they move rapidly on to additional treatments or alternative treatments. So I think having the research infrastructure that we have at the Royal Free does mean that patients in our local community are getting the best possible care.
And can you talk a little bit more about the opportunity that the Institute of Immunity and Transplantation affords us? So obviously they moved into the Pairs building a year ago, and I guess in your lovely model that explains that step through from laboratory research into clinical research, I guess the work in the Pairs building is at that earlier stage and then moves into the CRF. But how do you see that interplay developing, and what advantages does that give us?
So I think, as I mentioned, that UCL is one of the leading biomedical research universities in the world. The Pairs building is now an important part of that, and the discoveries that are made that lead potentially to therapies can now be directly translated into early phase clinical trials in the CRF and onwards into later phase clinical trials. But I think I also hopefully made the point that there is a two-way flow. So in the trial that I described, for example, the samples that are taken during the clinical trial move back to the laboratory. Those are analysed, and the effect of the treatment is looked at in great detail. And that understanding of the effect of treatment allows us to refine the treatment further. So there's a constant iteration going from the laboratory through to the clinic and back again. And I think the co-location of the laboratory right next to the hospital really facilitates that type of interaction, which ultimately is for the benefit of patients.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that network of NIHR CRFs across the country, and indeed the CRFs that are not within the NIHR. What options are there for information sharing or for collaboration between all of those different facilities? Do they act as a group sometimes, or are there opportunities for them to support each other?
Absolutely. It is very much a network of CRFs. There is an annual conference which is actually coming up in a few weeks' time, where all of the CRFs get together and they share operational processes, so best practice, and there are many shared documents so that every CRF isn't reinventing the wheel, and that's in addition to sharing discoveries, sharing protocols, and training staff. So I think the other thing is that there is increasing ability to highlight trials which are ongoing, which allows patients and clinicians to know what the trial portfolio is in a certain clinical research facility, and if appropriate, refer patients onto that facility. And that's already been happening in cancer, in the experimental medicine cancer networks, in which patients may be undergoing genetic profiling to identify which mutations are present in their cancer, and it may be that a particular protocol which targets that mutation is ongoing in another clinical research facility, and sharing that type of information across the network allows patients to access trials all over the country.
And you alluded to the pace of COVID research when you were talking. Do you think there's anything that the scientific community more broadly may change in terms of how it behaves as a result of what we learned about working at that very high pace? Do you think there are opportunities, for example, for cancer trials to do things differently?
Yeah, I think we certainly learned a lot during that period. I think part of it was that there was a huge investment by funding bodies, and also an imperative amongst within the regulatory environment to make sure that the red tape was cut through and trials could be processed as rapidly as possible. There was also a national prioritization of clinical trials. So these trials which were directed towards identifying treatments of COVID were classified as urgent public health studies, and they were fast-tracked through the system, which is why we were so effective, why the UK was so effective. The flip side of that was that during COVID, clinical research in other areas really suffered. For example, in cancer, many clinical trials had to be suspended to allow our research staff to work on COVID studies, and there was, deprioritization of lots of other areas. So I think, in order to answer your question, we can speed things up in the way that COVID trials were increased, but we need additional resources to do that, so that we can deliver all of these types of research at the same pace.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question about the levelling up plan for research funding. How do you think that may affect the CRF?
Well, we were very fortunate to be funded in the current environment. There is a lot of pressure, quite rightly, to distribute research funding around the country. But during this round, there were new CRFs also funded outside of London, so in Bristol and other cities in the north. So I think that I think ultimately about half the funding was concentrated in London, but the other half went to CRFs outside of London. So that, I think, there has been a redistribution.
Right. And we've got a question about the role of the Royal Free Charity in supporting the setting up of the CRF. So I'll read it. I'll read it aloud. So it seems that the charity took a well-informed gamble by giving you an early funding boost, so that the facility could look match fit for the NIHR. How important is it to have organisations like the Royal Free Charity that can make those sorts of gambles? And do you think there are other areas you could extrapolate that to within the Royal Free family?
I think it's money is very tight everywhere, and I think it's very difficult to access funding like this, which is slightly speculative. I think we certainly felt at the beginning that we had a good case to develop a CRF at the Royal Free, but ultimately it simply wouldn't have been possible without the funding by the charity. I think the other important aspect of our particular experience was that there were other CRFs funded in the UK and in London, but not to the extent that we were funded. And I think the reason for that is that we had already shown a very strong commitment at the Royal Free, both in terms of identifying space and appointing staff in advance of the application. So I think that we were able to provide a very compelling case, and I think that was rewarded. I think now that we have the clinical research facility, we can also leverage additional income. So I mentioned in my talk that the investment of the NIHR leveraged almost twice as much income from industry, and the same applies to our local CRF. So I would anticipate that although the NIHR has invested about 5 million in our facility, we will be able to leverage at the same again from industry and other grant income. So I think that relatively small, well, it's not small, it was a very significant investment, but in terms of the added value, I think that has been huge.
Great. That, of course, is one thing we talk to donors about an awful lot. Lots of them would like to make sure that the money that they're entrusting us with is going to turn into really significant legacy for them, which I think in this case absolutely it has. We've got a question from Nigel, which is specifically around clinical trials. Is success influenced by the patient's age? I guess Megan was talking about being a very young patient. Is success influenced by the patient's age, or are further trials required to determine that aspect?
I think that's a really interesting question. As many of you will be aware, illnesses accumulate as we get older. So cancer is typically a disease of our older years. And many trials, unfortunately, still have age limits. Fortunately, that's becoming less common. So most cancer trials that we run don't have an age limit. And I think that's important because age per se is not an indication of your general fitness. So I think the trials that we do are often highly selective and not always generally applicable to patients in the community, which is why it's important once a drug has been approved that we continue to do research to understand how effective those drugs are once they get out into the general population, because it may turn out, for example, that patients who are much less fit or who have other problems like diabetes or high blood pressure don't experience the benefit that was demonstrated in the clinical trial. So that's that ongoing monitoring of drugs once they're out in the community is very important.
And a question that's come through on the chat. Megan's video is an extraordinary watch. How hard is it for you to manage people's expectations and hope when they participate in trials?
So I think Megan really does demonstrate so many aspects of clinical trial participation. I think what was clear from her description is that she had run out of options and was looking for clinical trials in the hope that it would help her. And I think it's really important, particularly for early phase clinical trials, that those expectations are managed, because we know that many early phase clinical trials don't provide benefit. And the other point that Megan made at the end is that she hoped that other people would benefit. So I think the reason that people go into clinical trials is partly because they hope to get some benefit, but I think there is some element of altruism, that they are doing something which may be of benefit to others in the future. But I think ultimately what one has to be very honest with patients. Megan obviously understood that going into this clinical trial at the beginning was a very big commitment, and it has been for her, and that things may not benefit them, and that there may be side effects. We're now obliged to give very, very comprehensive information sheets, which often run to 20 or 30 pages of dense text. Those can be pretty indigestible for patients, so it's very important that we support that written information with detailed and digestible verbal information to make sure patients really understand what they're letting themselves in for.
And we have a question on liver cancer. So you talked about the fact that liver cancer is one of the fastest rising cancers in the developed world, and one of the globally one of the largest. Can you talk about what might be driving that rise in liver cancer cases?
Yeah. So unlike most cancers, there are some very, very clear drivers for liver cancer, and those vary around the world. So 50% of global liver cancer actually occurs in China, and that's a direct consequence of hepatitis B virus, which causes liver damage, cirrhosis, inflammation, and that drives liver cancer. So viral hepatitis is a very important risk, and in the West we have a slightly higher incidence of hepatitis C virus infection, which is in our patient population accounts for about 15% of patients with liver cancer. On the bright side, we now have vaccinations for hepatitis B. So in Taiwan, for example, the rate of liver cancer is rapidly going down because patients are all vaccinated at birth for hepatitis B. Similarly, for hepatitis C, we now have drugs that can cure hepatitis C. So we expect over the coming years that liver cancer related hepatitis C will also start to decline. However, what is rapidly increasing is liver disease due to fatty liver disease, which is common in patients with diabetes, and also alcohol-related liver disease. So in addition to the sort of trials that I talked about, public health is really important to try and prevent liver cancer. And obviously treating viral hepatitis is an important prevention, but also health education in terms of alcohol consumption. We have an epidemic of obesity in the West, with 25% of people being obese. That clearly is storing up problems for the future. So on the back of those factors, liver cancer is rapidly increasing. In fact, it's the most rapidly increasing liver cancer cause of death in the West at the moment.
Thank you. I think I've managed to cover all of the questions. So in that case, it's only left for me to say an enormous thank you to you and again to Megan for participating. The CRF, of course, represents just one of the ways that the Royal Free Charity is able to support our research community at the Trust. And we are particularly pleased that we're able to support early stage projects that may not yet be in a position to attract larger funding. And we have a very strong track record over many years of supporting lots of projects that go on to get funding from bodies like the NIHR. We can only do that thanks to the generosity of everybody who donates to the charity. I know many people watching this video will have contributed to recent appeals, and some of you may have given to specific projects. Thank you very much indeed for your support. As I mentioned earlier, this series of talks is a showcase for innovation and excellence in patient care and in staff experience. If you've got a particular topic you'd like us to cover in a future talk, please do let us know. You can email the charity on info@royalfreecharity.org, or you can drop a note into the Q&A box if you're taking part live. If you've enjoyed the series, don't forget that all of the talks are available on the charity's YouTube channel for you to watch again or share with friends and colleagues. Thank you again for your support. Thank you again to Tim for speaking with us this evening, and good night.